So welcome to the Tech Positive Parenting series. We're here to talk about fostering divergent thinking in kids, helping adults and parents stay ahead of the curve and hopefully staying ahead of your kids. Topics include divergent thinking, cognitive skills, future readiness, and anything else in this area that catches your attention. So think about what you want to address today, bring out some questions, and when we've had a short panel, feel free to contribute through the conversation. On the panel today we have Yat Siu, parent, technologist, and the CEO of Outblaze, plus the co-founder of Dalton Learning Labs, which is a STEAM-based project learning lab for kids, which bridges the gap between the current educational system and the future needs of the economy. Also, we're delighted to welcome Christine Greenberg. She's the principal of the Harbour School, which is 10 years in Hong Kong, just happily celebrated the anniversary, as a progressive and private school with a customized approach to learning. Christine's interest is navigating the curricula, generating creativity, and responsible online citizenship. And she brings experience as a parent with 4 kids, plus also a professional educational background. So with no further ado, before we start with a question and answer, I'd like to introduce Yat to take us through a short presentation.
Thank you. So my talk is really first just to set the scene, right, in terms of where we think the future is going to go and what we should be thinking about. And then Christine will join us for sort of a talk and commentary. Great. So let's take ourselves 2 decades past, just so we have an idea of. Back then, I guess we have enough parents here, so we know the age of Backstreet Boys, Spice Girls, and the Hong Kong handover. So you roughly have an idea, give yourself a mental mind map of what life was like then. And just to make it clear, this was the #1 phone of its era at that time. Right? Obviously far removed from what we're using today. And I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, had held one of those devices. But around the same time, something else happened as well. This was Garry Kasparov, who lost the match to basically Deep Blue, which is basically IBM's supercomputer, basically in the game of chess. And at that time, people were already talking about how sort of the advent of AI, robots will take over, scenes of Terminator. Everyone thought basically this was going to be the end of the world, the computer beat man. But of course, this was machine learning. It was a form of learning that was still based on brute force, essentially fast computational processes, in which it was able to sort of analyze all the moves and counter moves based on a vast array of potential moves that the opposing side could make. But it was never good enough to be something that was sort of deeper than that. Almost 2 decades later, AlphaGo came around. This was developed by Google's DeepMind team. This one uses deep learning. And the reason why deep learning is important is because that is the real revolution that's taking place in AI, actually for the last 5 years. Because the game of Go is a game of infinite possibilities. And it actually requires intuition, and what some people might say, a form of creativity to be able to play and win. And basically, a few years ago, Lisa Dahl basically lost the match to AlphaGo. And afterwards, Kejian basically was absolutely crushed. He was a #1 Go player. So this is kind of where the world is headed. And the reason why deep learning, the difference here, as you can see, just in 2 decades, Deep Blue, the machine that beat Garry Kasparov, was 100 million computations per second. The iPhone X does 600 billion operations per second. So the power that you have in your sort of pocket trumps that of a device, of a piece of furniture that basically was supposed to be the supercomputer of its time just 2 decades ago. So the reason why I'm sort of highlighting that is because some of you may have heard of Moore's Law. I won't go into the details of it, but essentially it has been true pretty much since Gordon Moore from Intel coined it. Roughly every 18 to 24 months, the compute power basically doubles. And that basically creates an exponential growth in computing, which is the reason why computers become faster, which is why your iPhone or whatever smartphone you have constantly gets faster. The moment you buy it, it becomes outdated. And of course, we need mass computation so our kids can play on Snapchat, right? So, but the reason why, when you have these mass computations, technologies like Snapchat, in terms of their face recognition and sort of the face patterns, becomes possible. Because now, with 600 billion operations a second, you can actually analyze the nuances of the face and then create basically masks with it. It may seem like a trivial thing because it's comical, but actually this kind of computing power is necessary to be able to do it because it actually now is processing almost like a neural net. The way that I look at you and I can make instant recognition as to who you are without having a computer that's basically identifying who I am and basically some kind of sort of mass calculation, I'm able to basically analyze it instantly, right? I just look at you and I know exactly who you are. The computer can do that as well. This was not possible just a decade ago. And deep learning, the main element, and why this is so important, is that deep learning is a self-learning algorithm. It basically simulates its world, its environment, by itself over time. So in order to beat, when AlphaGo 3 beat Kejiang, they didn't play Go with anyone. He just played in his mind, basically by itself, 100 billion times, or more like 1 trillion times, and simulated each environment. And then it created shortcuts and knew what was the best, it basically created experience. Machine learning can't do that. Machine learning just takes a data set and tries to understand it to give a defined output. Deep learning is different. And this is where the future is going to go. So an example of this is, I'm taking an example here where you combine the deep learning knowledge of different languages, and basically you're able to give this example, for instance. Yes? All right. I'm going to have to press it. Uh-oh.
The irony, right?
There we go.
第一次来到中国，我非常高兴。人工智能正在改变世界。
So, of course, does Trump actually speak Chinese? Right. This was all done computer generated. And it was able to do it by simply analyzing Trump's voice to see what his accent and sound looks like, and essentially mirroring it with deep learning and Chinese language. So this is just one example that's possible. And again, how much of this is actually real or not? It's difficult for us as humans to sort of identify. And in fact, if some of you have watched the sort of Google presentation for Google Duplex, where essentially Google itself made phone calls through the computer to basically identify sort of appointment times. I mean, it probably completely aced the Turing test, right? But just essentially sort of the measure that people give to identify whether you can actually tell that it's a computer or not. So this is the future we're headed to. And of course, cost of storage is going down, bandwidth is getting faster. You just have to look back 10 years and say, well, how much storage did I have? How much storage do I have today for that price? And underpinning this is the fact that, of course, the cost of that is also constantly decreasing. So this is a Raspberry Pi, and it's about the size of, it's smaller than a $5 bill, and it will continue to become smaller, as you can see from the handheld devices, and it will also continue to be cheaper. This costs $5. In about 5 years, this will cost maybe 50 cents, except with maybe 5 times the capacity, right? 10 times the capacity. Eventually, the cost of compute will be insignificant. And if you look at technology, broadly speaking, anything that technology touches becomes, anything that was scarce, essentially becomes abundant. Right? Whether this is knowledge, whether this is speed, whether this is anything that technology touches. Even if you think about food, right? When technology touches food with its production capability, it also makes it more abundant than before. So that's the trend in a future where, of AI and abundance and so forth. So what does it mean? Okay, I'll just do this. I'll just skip that one quickly. So what might this mean? So obviously, in the instant that you have right now, everyone, for instance, can take photos, which is what's happening right now. Right? So now, I think in 2017, over 1 trillion photos were taken. But in the past, taking a photo costs money, not just because you have to do production, to store it, you have to archive it somewhere. Now, you take a photo, what storage do you have? You don't even know what you're storing, you're just putting it out there, right? How many thousands of images have you taken? But with all of that also, because the cost of storage is essentially insignificant, you can store that, that's your value. But then the data is learned and generated from the images that you take out, and the computer becomes smarter as a result. And then the other aspect here is, of course, future work. This is a quote by the MacArthur Foundation. And depending who you talk to, broadly speaking, everyone sort of seems to indicate that you're going to be, our children are going to be in a job that's not yet invented. Right? Now, when you look at that stat, and you just apply this for the last 7 years as to what are the top companies by market cap, and where have they been and where have they gone, you can see already a big shift. Right? essentially, most of the companies are all now in technology, driving that area of exponential growth because they're in a space that is growing exponentially. You don't see that many banks. I don't see any law firms. Right? Basically, it's all in the area of technology. But that's just in the last 7 years. That doesn't even include all of the sort of tens of thousands of startups and new cool companies that just emerged even in the last 1 or 2 years. For people coming and graduating today, they're already going in jobs that didn't exist even when they went to school or even 5 or 6 years ago. So the environment is going to be uncertain as to who they're going to job. This is just an illustration of most common job listings in the USA today. Right? So truck drivers, sales supervisors, stock clerks, right? You can just see where that's going to go with AI and sort of job market. And so I just want to leave it with maybe on this topic as an example of what, when we think about change in the future, it's not just here's a self-driving car and it's autonomous, and sort of Lyft is giving this example that in the future, human rideshare drivers are actually going to disappear. And basically everything's going to be automated with self-driving cars, which you already can see today. And the car will earn you money because I will own the car and it will drive people about for cash. Right? That's kind of the future. And we can kind of imagine that already because it's there. Right? The car becomes sort of an investment class. But one thing that most people don't think about, the other consequence, is this: empty parking lots. Because once the car is constantly roaming around, driving people, then why do you need a parking lot? But when you think about the design and architecture of our cities today, it's designed around roads and parking lots. Just think about Hong Kong, right? When all parking lots become obsolete, maybe in the next 10 or 20 years, what does it mean? Are we prepared to think like that? Are we ready for that kind of future? Not just from a technology, but from a paradigm standpoint. And this is only one example. Okay, so this is kind of where we're going to start our talk, but very quickly, some quick thoughts. How can we prepare? Generally, do what a machine cannot, is sort of the mantra that we like to say. And what does that mean? Where will humans add value? So I'm not going to go into the philosophical debate as to, will humans have value in the future? Will there be Terminator? But I think I just want to sort of highlight a few things that I think is important. One, so when Kejiang lost to AlphaGo 3, he cried. Computers don't do that. They don't know how to cry. They have feelings. They have emotions. That's something that we have. We should nurture to our advantage. How? We can discuss later, right? Creativity, obviously that's a focus of our topic. And then the element of empathy, which I'm sure we can discuss in depth. And then I want to conclude one other thing, which is some of you may have seen, which is the imaginary thinking test that was done by George Land at Jarman. And basically George Land created this test, or a similar version of this test, to see how, for NASA scientists, essentially. Right? Because, if you fly someone up to the moon and stuff happens, then you better have someone who's really creative, because that situation has never really happened before. So he took that imaginative thinking test, essentially to basically test how divergent the thinking skills are. And 5-year-olds generally scored 98%. So they were very imaginative, very creative in how to solve it. By the time they were 10 years old, that number dropped to 30%. By the time they were 15, 12%. And this is the same cohort of people that he followed. And then he did another test for adults who were who were over their 20s, and that number was 2%. So this is the contrast. Our children are apparently born very creatively, very divergently, and somehow, over time, they don't become so. They become much more commercial in their thinking. And there is some debate as to, certainly Ken Robinson would tell you that it's a role that schools are responsible for that. But there's other people who basically say that's just a natural order of things, because you have to sort of structure around that. So I'm not going to be here to discuss that, but on that note, I think maybe we can start. Yes, thank you.
Yes, thanks, Yat. So a lot of food for thought there. So a lot of food for thought there, and the impact of technology in all aspects of our lives today. But let's perhaps focus in here on the core area that we want to talk about, the way that mobile devices have become so prevalent in life, particularly among young people. So perhaps I can start by asking Christine a question about divergent thinking and how you think, as an educator and parent, that divergent thinking can help kids, and how parents can be more proactive in adapting to these trends that we've seen in the presentation.
Okay, thanks for having me here, by the way. So divergent thinking, it's really the ability for some of us who are new to this idea, it's really the ability to come up with multiple solutions to one question. And convergent thinking is having one solution. So I argue that you need both. I do argue that in most schools or in most parenting, the style is more to come up with the right answer. You need both. Why? Because if you're decorating a room, you need one answer for the length and the width of the carpet that you're measuring for. It's not a make-believe answer, right? But at the same time, I know that from the workplace, when I'm hiring for teachers, or when I'm working with an individual, it's very attractive to me. It makes my job better and easier if the person comes with solutions and says, have you thought about this way to look at the problem? And that's what we want for our students. So one of the issues, though, is that we're going against a system and a history, most of us as parents and also as people who have been students ourselves, it's a very traditional, long history, where we're taught to need to know what the answer is, because that's what gets us a good grade, and a good grade is what gets us into a good college and then happily ever after, right? But your presentation has basically told us about how we don't know what that happily ever after looks like. You can't just be a doctor now and have a life that is going to be a great life. We don't know what that is. I mean, you know, the traffic that people use WebMD, I'm not saying it's going to replace doctors, but it is changing the nature of our interaction with people in very professional fields. So with divergent thinking, I think we need to work with kids. We need to make sure that students are taught to ask questions. And when's the last time that you heard of a curriculum or an assessment where the questions that they're generating are what gives them a good grade? Usually it's what the answer is, right? And that's unfortunate. One unfortunate outcome of standardized testing in some areas, not just the United States, but the United States happens to be my point of reference, so I'll use it, is that when they look at test scores, they say, okay, well, we need more time getting, we need better test scores, so therefore we're going to decrease things like the arts or music or PE. And I think that's a very unhealthy attitude, just because, one, it doesn't celebrate the culture of, one issue of divergent thinking is that you can communicate that culturally by the people that you populate. So for example, if you have a school where success is defined in only one very narrow way, you get a good grade point average in terms of literacy or math, and that's our definition of what success is in our school. So in a way, that's communicating to those students that that's what we value, that's the only way you can be successful. That's a little aspect of divergent thinking because, I mean, of not having divergent thinking or not establishing that. Because essentially you want kids to say, to be comfortable with different intelligences or different ways that they're able to be successful. So that's one.
I totally agree. I think you do, to your point, you do need divergent and convergent thinking. But I think one of the interesting things is that what happens in school today still is that we spend a lot of time on convergent thinking in the process of the convergent thinking. I'll give you an example. Let's say, take math, a popular example. When I grew up, I wasn't allowed to use a calculator because, you know, you don't use a calculator, even though that technology existed in the 80s. So I just dated myself. Anyway, but of course, I knew what to solve. I knew that this would give me the right answer. So I could get to that answer faster and more effectively if you let me use a calculator. No, you gotta write down the formula. I know how to do the formula, but I gotta do the whole thing over. It would take me 10 minutes because of some crazy derivative function, I don't know, whatever. It was just a waste of time. And it's a waste of space. Now, if you think about, once the calculator was introduced, I don't think it's a coincidence that the rise in general knowledge of mathematics and sciences increased because everyone got to use a calculator. Because the calculator is an extension, is a form of technology that made math easy. As I said before, technology basically makes it into a commodity. Math skills became a commodity. Everyone knows math. When I was a kid, math was reserved for geniuses. It was reserved for a small percentage of people who knew it well. They went to high, math high, they were sort of worshipped because they won the awards at the math competitions, and that was all great. But now, you know, today, an AI and a computer can do it just like that. And they're not rewarded for being able to calculate the math faster. They're rewarded because they know how to get to the answer. So I agree, you need to have convergent thinking.
Yeah.
But you're rewarded for being divergent in the approach and being then able to find the tools to give you the answer. Right? So I think that's, I agree with
Absolutely, yeah. As a parent, it's a struggle because one of our roles as a parent is to, you know, keep kids safe, make sure that they're moving on to a happy childhood. But I think one of the things that's, for me anyway, that's been a challenge is being a little bit agnostic about the way that I've been brought up. I'm not talking about in a religious sense, but I'm just having a healthy skepticism about practices that I've experienced. You know, even now, I have my oldest child is going to be applying for colleges. And I'm thinking, okay, well, he's interested in this field, these are the best schools. But says who, right? Says US News, well, that's an interesting, and by what metric? I mean, we know that US News, sometimes it measures or it rates colleges based on research dollars that are afforded rather than necessarily the good teaching that's happening there. So it's interesting.
I think also in the workplace it changes also because if you think about, I'm not sure about here, but certainly in our industry, how important is a college degree when you actually get employed versus actual work experience? And so, you know, when you think about going, for instance, a US college, you spend 4 years going to college, is that a good ROI? Generally speaking. And in fact, there's a lot of talk that perhaps the next big financial crisis in America will be student debt default.
Yeah.
Because the average debt ratio is somewhere between $300,000 to $400,000 US per student. That doesn't mean, even if you're in med school, forget that, right? So it's a big question, right? And that was a system that worked really well at the time for an industrial age. Right? But now, you know, we've come to a point where the computer can do all of these things. Actually, within just 3 to 6 months, you can probably obtain these skills very, very quickly. An example of that, for instance, that just recently was acquired is a company called General Assembly. General Assembly retrains essentially people to so-called the modern work sort of environment, like coding or whatever you want to call it, right? But within a 3 to 6 month program, they are employable in a different environment. And they get a job, but only in 3 to 6 months, because they don't need to have all of that formative education, because it is not important for what they're doing. That's not to say that there's no place for college. So, you know, I certainly would like a doctor to know all their stuff, because it could be in my stomach or something. But when you're coding and when you have computers that in fact, computers are probably going to self-code a lot of things as well. If you think about programming, it was very difficult. Certainly when I grew up, everything was machine learning. I mean, a sort of machine language. We had assembly code. People older than me had punch cards, right? And those are terrible, terrible days. But today, you're speaking English to the computer, literally. Right? And it would then create an output. You have to understand the syntax, but it's easier than learning Chinese. So consequently, that means the whole world can learn to code, because it's much simpler and much easier to do so. And that basically, again, commoditizes that skill set, and you can be productive in a very short period of time. And colleges today, I don't think are equipped for that.
So if computers are such fantastic tools and are changing our life in so many ways, then it's quite understandable why kids find them so absorbing and addictive.
Wow.
But how are we going to then help them overcome that addiction and then help them be more creative? Because I don't get the impression that they're being creative through that computer, through that device. Christine, what do you think?
So I'm going to answer it in a roundabout way. I think one of the dangers is that our generation, I'm going to speak in I'm Generation X, and it's great. I think I'm proud to be a Generation X person, but however, one of the downsides is we've sort of invented the idea of helicopter parenting. And why? It kind of makes sense, right? Because we are the first generation who really obsessed on the kind of plastic that our kids use to drink water, or BPA, etc. It's because we have all this information. We become hypersensitive and hyper-informed consumers. And so we have a tendency to micromanage that information to be good parents. I don't think, I was fed Tang growing up and watched lots of TV. I watched lots of TV growing up. I think I'm reasonably okay. So I think there's just that thing. I think we sometimes overthink things because we're in this culture where sometimes we crowdsource. Am I being a good parent if I send my kid to this? I mean, there are websites here in Hong Kong where parents get together and they say, well, this is a good school, or this isn't a good school, or this is a good thing, you should do this, and we've all become reliant on that. And I think that's positive, it builds culture and community, but the downside of it sometimes is it makes you feel like you're really competing against this kind of idea that there's such a thing as a good parent, and it's only one way. So to answer that question about computer use, I think one of the dangers with that is sometimes people want to hear something like, okay, 2 hours or less, or 20 minutes only on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. That's what works. That's the recipe. And it's not that easy. I think the danger with something like that is that when you have as a parent and you say, we're only doing 30 minutes a day, that might be right for some families and for certain ages. But for me, as a parent of teenagers, I have kids from 11 to 17 years old. I think I have kids from 12 to 17 years old. You know, is that sometimes when I have that mindset that electronics is bad and that time on electronics is bad, then I'm shutting down that conversation. Some of the most interesting conversations I've had with my teenagers have been, so why instead, because one of my pet peeves as a parent, and I'm sure some of you guys can relate, is when there's something about 11-year-old boys, it's just, you know, there's something about the brain that just fixates on video games, is when he watches, he doesn't play video games necessarily, but he's obsessed with people playing video games, making these inane commentaries on the video games they're playing, right? And they used to be like, why are you watching this? Why are you watching this? It's silly, turn it off. And that was a conversation. Well, one day I was just like, help me understand why you're interested in this. I'm completely confounded. And he was like, well, it's kind of like when someone watches sports and there's a commentary on it. And I'm just like, okay, interesting. So that was a point, and so we started talking about it. Whereas from before, and we'd had, you know, my son greets me with, I've only been on for 1 hour and I'm going to get off in 30 minutes. That's just the conversation that we have. This is how we have it at home. So he's used to this. But it was interesting for me because I learned something about that. I was like, I need to stop just being fixated over the time online is bad and having more like, what's interesting to you about it? How do you know that the decisions you're making when you're evaluating this game or this commentator on YouTube is a good thing? And that's a different conversation. So sometimes I think we come wanting to find out what the answer is to this recipe that I have no idea who's formulated this recipe for the perfect parent to make that perfect happy child 15 years from now. But I think it's dangerous to have this perception that there's one right answer, and simply because it shuts down the conversation, and you come from a place of judgment. One more thing, and
Sure,
I'm happy to really. Another interesting idea is, you know, with all this information that we have now, right? We're seeing a shift with educators, with teachers, going from the sage on the stage, or the person who knows all the information, imparting all this information, to being the person who's kind of a guide, or like a mentor in the classroom. We're trying to model that at our school, and we're trying to encourage that at our school, but it is difficult because teachers simply were not taught that way, and so it's interesting. So if we think that that works in schools, and I do think they do, because that's a way that you cultivate that relationship, then I feel that we should work like that as parents. You know, rather than I'm telling you that this technology is bad and you should only be on for 30 minutes a day, or you should only be on weekends. We're not coming from a perspective of how am I understanding what's appealing to you about this? How can I have that conversation? What kind of ethics are you know, you ask a 13-year-old about Instagram, and if you say get off that, it's a point of judgment. Whereas if you say, help me understand what's going on. So what happens when you have so many likes? Does that translate to your friendship at school? It's actually a really interesting conversation.
Thank you, Christine. That's a really good point. Let me just pause this conversation for a second. I'd like to ask our audience a question here. It seems that Christine's pointing to this generational divide, and implying that we really, as adults, as parents, we need to look at technology differently in order to understand what our offspring and what our students know, and why they're doing what they're doing, and what they're getting from it, and how we can help them. So, how many people here are parents? And so how many of those parents, pretty much everybody, apart from me, I'm not, so. How many of you feel that you've overcome that generational divide, understand what your children do with those devices, and have learned to empathize around it, improve for yourself, and help them improve their experience? Who can raise their hand and feel comfortable in this respect? To some degree. You're nodding.
Kind of, because maybe my experience is still not enough in the sense that my kids are just 6 and 8. But I've gone through completely, like, you know, when they were 2, let's say, right? So I was like, no, do not touch that. Now they are 8, they would never, it's there, they wouldn't even touch it, and sometimes it's me So let's check this. When it's one of those questions that I cannot take, and that happens already, like, okay, let's go and check. So I'm trying to encourage that, and I totally support what you were saying, because I think this kind of yes or no, in general, there's this risk that at some point you will lose that ability to say no, and it's still a distance, right? So my philosophy towards parenting, and again, I'll see what happens there,
Yeah.
so very young. It's like the same, like, you know, some people are overprotective even with going outdoors, right? So don't do that, you will fall. No, go fall down, and you'll see. So it's my view, our role is to make them strong enough for that fall down, right? So if I talk about what Instagram likes mean to you, or I talk about how Google is made, and when it's, now let's Google it. No, but what is Google? Like, how is it built? So if I just give them the tools to understand how things work and what it means to fall down and how you then stand up again, my philosophy is that when you don't need to ban anything, and I'm personally completely against the 30 minutes, it's like, and again, maybe I have to step into that, because now I'm seeing that the iPad is there, they will come and talk to me, and times are gone when they were like, oh, can I have it for 5 minutes? No. So, whatever. Answer to your questions or no, I don't know, but I feel that so far so good.
I think the one thing that's really interesting to your point is just we have a certain generation, I'm a Gen X as well, and we normally classify generations in a traditional 20 to 30 year vector because we count it as when the next generation is born. But a generation is also defined by experiences, right? The experience of which generation has gone and experienced the war or the Great Depression, or some kind of crisis, some kind of situation that happened, because it defines you. And 100 or 150 years ago, that would be, for instance, farmers, right? So I'm a farmer, and my next generation is a farmer, and I can relate to that, because you're going to be a farmer. But the problem right now is that whatever you're doing today, your children will be doing something completely different. And it's not just when they graduate, it's actually happening within a span of 3 to 5 years. So if you take a look back just 5 years ago, what was hot? What were your children doing? Where were you, right? And then just take that forward. Actually, you have no relationship to Snapchat likely, or very little relationship to Kik, or very little relationship, maybe relationship to Instagram. But that Instagram was really hip with teenagers 5 years ago. Instagram is kind of waning off because parents are there. Right? Facebook used to be the place for college kids and young people who hung out. And now, after the parents and grandmas started to invade it, I was like, yeah, that's not cool. I'm not going to friend my mom here, right? That's kind of awkward. And that's a situation that's happening at an accelerated rate. So our understanding of that is actually that tension is much broader. So I have a family of 3, 13, 11, and 8. And I think, and with myself, I think I have 3 generations. Because the way my son interacts with the computer and the way my youngest son interacts is different. Everything is a touchscreen to my youngest, and for my older one, he's still comfortable with the keyboard. Right? My youngest speaks to everything. So he talks to Alexa, he talks to his Google Home, and he talks to his iPad. And he actually doesn't really want to type, right? Because
the youngest?
Okay. Because he's totally comfortable. And in fact, that's just a generational example. We know that voice can be efficient for us as adults, but we're not comfortable because we haven't done it. So for us to sort of pick up the phone and talk to it, we're crazy. Right? Just imagine if you walk in the road and say, oh, Google, do this. Suddenly people start talking like this. It's like, well, what are you doing? Right? It seems strange because it was a generational norm at that time. It won't be that for people who are growing up right now, sort of Gen Z or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. I think Instagram's really interesting because it started off mostly with photos. And I didn't know this, my 13-year-old taught me this, is that you can also now buy things on Instagram. I didn't know that. And it's a very interesting marketing opportunity. And see, I wouldn't have known that had she not experimented with that angle of it as her own sort of business person herself.
And I think when kids are, because of technology, kids have tools that are actually superior to us. Now think of that power dynamic in your home.
Yeah.
It used to be that you were full authority. When my mom said do this, that was it, right? There was absolutely nothing I could really do. And also, she held power not just because of economic power, but just influence and knowledge. Right? Same thing with teachers. They have power of knowledge. That's not true anymore. The 10-year-old actually has all. Sorry, please.
I'm sorry. Can I ask a question as we did that?
Oh, yeah, sure. No, I guess my point simply is that power dynamic has changed, right? So that means the family dynamic also changes. In fact, the school dynamic changes because you're parlaying sort of knowledge and power as a way to influence. And now actually, wait a second, that's not what I read on Google, right? Or, and I know a lot of schools that ban Wikipedia and other sources online because should they really ban it, or they're banning it because it's inconvenient, because suddenly, you're maybe sort of talking about something that you've read before. My son is is struggling a bit with his physics class in school right now because he started getting into quantum mechanics, only because he visited Google X and had a visit and they talked to him about it. He started getting into it. And suddenly he started asking questions about, wait, but I guess the universe is not made of atoms, right? In fact, it's dark matter and dark energy. But school still teaches you that it's atoms because it's convenient, right? But it's not true. So it's things like that happen. And this was only 10 years ago. And everyone will go through that experience eventually. So that just makes the whole thing.
Well, I just want to say something about what Mark said earlier. He said that a lot of us are here to try to stay ahead of our kids, and I don't know if that's possible.
And I don't know if they should.
Yeah, on certain areas,
So did you have a question?
Sorry, I think I just have a question more than anything. I think for me at least, I have 2 boys, 3 years old and 1.5. But I feel like parenting in this day and age is like navigating a lot of uncertainty, especially when it comes to digital experience. So for example, so you mentioned that sometimes when we actually try to parent our child in terms of asking them to have a time limit in terms of when their engagement with devices, it comes from a judgmental, it could come across as a judgmental call. But I guess a lot of it also for me is I question whether are we also equipped with outdated advice from as parents, for example, because scientifically or whatever scientific reports that we rely upon say that if your child is exposed to too much screen time, it actually affects their ability to focus as an adult. So stuff like that actually creates fear in parents, of course. And so when I tell my child, I do the same thing. Okay, you can watch YouTube, but you have like 30 minutes. And I feel that, how do I know 30 minutes is appropriate? I don't. Right. But I'm guided by the fear that if he spends too much time,
what happens in 35 minutes?
Yeah, something will happen, like he could go haywire, and so he'll be that disobedient child in class, So I think I guess it's a question really, right? Are we really well equipped to navigate this landscape in terms of, even the scientific findings? Like there's a lot of things about, say one day people say that beetroot is good for you. And another day, beetroot is good for you. Eat more, more of it will make you smart. But the next day, oh no, too much beetroot, right? So I feel like it's the same thing with, screen time or devices. How do we really, I think balance is the wrong word, but how do we really, I think how do we really derive the best value in terms of cultivating this and embracing the age of digital? How do we really do that?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start first. So in the first thing that I typically I get to ask this question a fair bit, right? Because we're in technology. We make video games, by the way, for a living. So, a lot of kids love us, but at the same time, a lot of parents are like, yes, okay, yes. What about that video game? Anyway, the general the one thing, it's tough to be a parent today because it used to be that you can just outsource this to school and they would take care of it for you, and then they come back and they're a whole child and everything's cool. But that is not true because of everything we just discussed. But I feel very strongly that the one person who has the most vested interest in the success of the child is obviously, in most cases, the parent.
Yeah.
And school had many other functions in the past because actually, for a long time, parents did not have the most vested interest in their children because of child labor and factory work and industrial age. So schools were not only places for learning, they were places of protection and security. So the kids would go there and actually not suddenly get whisked away to a farm or something when they were working at like in a coal mining from like at 8 years old. So there are many reasons why school was important, not just for the academic purposes. But today we have the privilege of just focusing obviously on academic purposes. And now the parent actually is supposed to be equipped to know what's right for the child. And the other flip side of this is if you think about our engagement with children, we used to play sports, we are happy to take our children to their soccer game, to the basketball game, and all that stuff. But when it's their Minecraft time, we're not in there. So we don't know anything about it. So I'm not even sitting there watching his Minecraft game. He's just doing it by himself. But every other activity, I'm happy to look at him and do what he does. So there's a disconnect in understanding because we're actually not engaged in their world. Right? We say it's a computer, so it's one-on-one and I'm not involved. That's not true, actually. The parental generation should consider potentially playing with them on Minecraft, being in that environment, or at minimum, sit behind them and watch and engage and ask questions. Ask why. Why are you doing it? No different than you would go to a basketball game and you sit behind them as well. Those are paradigms that are actually not that different from the generations, except that we somehow, when it's a screen, because it's so one-on-one, we feel excluded when we don't have to be. And I would also argue that you actually do know what is the right time once you understand it, because you actually understand your child really well. Because every child is different. Between your siblings, they all are completely different, right? It might be 30 minutes for one kid, it might be 1 hour for another kid, right? And to the question maybe on science constantly changes, so yes, you have to inform yourself. But the good thing about technology is that you can actually check all these sources as long as you're willing to spend the time on it. One common example, and I'm not saying that sort of screen time shouldn't be regulated, it depends on the individual, but there's a very sort of, there's a saying about how screen time actually is really, really bad for your eyes because it sort of makes your eyesight worse. And, I won't go into the specific science of it, but at the time, this was a common refrain, in that sort of common discussion topic in the 80s and 90s, and that was true. Because monitors basically typically had a 50 or 60 hertz refresh rate. And so your eyes basically actually can detect the flicker. So if you remember looking at your computer screen back in the day, you would get much tired much faster. Because actually, even though you can't see it, your eye detects it. So actually your pupils in the retina start moving and you become tired. Now at 120 or 130 hertz refresh rate, it's so fast that actually you can't detect it. So there's other elements about brightness, which certainly is another topic, but it's gotten better. Right? And then certainly, if I look at my kids who use a lot of Kindle, because when we travel it's easier than carrying a stack of books, they can read for a long time and they're not tired at all because the paperwhite background has low refresh rate and therefore is much more comfortable for the eyes. So there is, but you've got to, I guess what I'm saying is you have to spend the time. But we have the luxury of that information pool that we didn't have before.
So, a couple of things. In terms of, I definitely believe in regulation at certain ages. Just because if you're spending a lot of time staring at the screen, that's a lot of time you could be spent doing other things. So if we believe, there's research out there, like Hart and Risley, one of the oldest research about how people develop language, or how kids develop language, is if somebody is staring at a screen, that's time that they're not spent talking back and forth with their parents. So there's a cost to that, right? So if you're spending a lot of time, 2 hours on a screen, then you're doing that as a toddler and so on. And if we believe that there's a lot of people who do, that for people to be happy, that happiness is derived from personal relationships. So again, if all of that time you're spending is a solitude in playing whether it's solitaire or whether it's solitaire on an iPad, it's the same thing. However, it does change. If they're playing Minecraft and then they're talking to a friend in New Jersey and in Korea who left the school 2 years ago, then it's a different interaction because you are still cultivating those personal relationships. So that's how I discuss it now with my kids, because I know that, we finally had World War III in our house. I was like, that's it, enough screen time. I mean, again, these were, at the time they were 10 to 16, and I was like, enough. Like, we need to figure out what the rules are. And they kept saying, well, what's so bad about electronics? And I was like, you know what? I've just taken for granted that they know. They don't understand. I said, my fear is that you're not going to be able to relate to people, IRL, right, in real life. My fear is that when you go off to college, and I just spent a lot of time talking to them about my fear. Like, I said, my fear is that when you go to college and I'm not there, that you're going to spend a bunch of time in your dorm room and you're going to be this person who doesn't know how to socialize. And once they understood that, they were like, oh, okay. So rather than just my saying, okay, enough with the screen time, we had this big conversation. So our last conversation on it, and I sometimes ask them questions. One of the questions I asked them was, would you marry somebody if you were just texting with them after 2 years? I mean, we've all heard of situations like this, right? I mean, your kids are very young, your kids are very young. My kids are older, and I'm just thinking, you know, what is your thought process in this? If you were texting with somebody for a long time and you never met them, would you marry them? And they were like, absolutely not. And I thought that was encouraging for me, because I was thinking that they were, well, because I was thinking, you know, they've been raised on this, they text, they don't even do phone calls anymore. They get mad at me if I call them unless it's an emergency. So I was thinking this, but it was interesting because they were very conservative about this idea, about courtship and about how you have to spend time. And for me, that was a very hopeful thing. So sometimes I think that when we assume that all the time spent on tech, if we're not having those conversations, then we need to look into what they're thinking and why they believe what they believe. And so I guess I'm saying as a parent is, do what's right for your family, of course, and for the age, but don't come away from an article and just all of a sudden say, well, this is what they say is going to work, so that's exactly what's going to work with my kid. It's a very long conversation.
I think
Ongoing.
I think it's a good example. I think in what they just gave here, because it's not about sort of the function of it. You basically already over time taught them values.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so
yes,
they simply confirmed the values you already wanted them to have, and because of the process of positive parenting, they have those values. So they knew what was right. You didn't really have to tell them that, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that really, as parents, is the most we can do, because we will not be ahead when it comes to knowledge, right?
Right.
But we will be ahead in terms of the values we want to sort of imbue our children, whether it's family values, loyalty, whatever it is that makes your family tick. Maybe one thing that I suggest to people when it's about end of screen time, because you know I have 2 boys, so they play a lot of games, which is typically always let them complete their level or mission.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like an endpoint, right?
Yeah.
Because many parents don't play themselves, they don't know what that means.
Right.
So just understand what that means, and if you got to go sort of kill that zombie, or you have to finish that house, let them do that. Right?
Yes.
Give them a quest, and when they finish the quest, it gives them finality. Because otherwise, it's a bit like watching sort of like Game of Thrones, and you're just in the last 5 minutes. And there's a cliffhanger,
Right.
and someone's just about to get killed, and then essentially TV is off.
Right.
And then you wonder, you're agitated, and the child is agitated in the same situation.
Yeah.
You wonder, why are you agitated? Right? I mean, so it's kind of the same thing, really.
Yeah.
It's just in a virtual sense.
Or even just asking if you're on a mission. I think one of the interesting things that I've learned is, I'm a non-gamer, but I have 2 kids, the boys, who are serious gamers. And one of the things that intrigued me is, it's been a long time since I played a video game. I think it was like Mario Kart was the last game I played. And it's interesting to me how they've changed, because to your point about whether or not you can be creative in terms of gaming, is their own personal reasons for playing a game. So I was like, oh, what are you doing, Milo? And he said, well, I'm trying to see if I can, I'm like, you're doing the same thing over and over. He said, I'm trying to see if I can beat this guy in fewer moves. And I swim laps, and I'm thinking it's the same thing, with swimming laps, right? You have fewer strokes in order to be efficient. I'm like, that's an interesting strategic skill. He's removed himself from having to beat the level, and he's basically trying to, and I was appreciating that for a second. So I thought that was an interesting thing. It was a different function for him.
It is, and I think because technology, game environments are virtual sandboxes in which you can experiment, inform whether it's physics or whether it's sort of design thinking actually can be promoted through games, because you have to basically find a solution, you have to basically sort of go through a cycle. Look at Minecraft as an example.
Yes.
And especially when you play
And
Minecraft.
its longevity.
And its longevity. When
Yeah.
you play Minecraft with a group of friends, actually it's the perfect design thinking game, right? Because you need to, I'm building a home, why, for who, right? And then sort of I'm going through the process of development. Actually, I need to make it better function. I need to learn how to code. And then where did I learn how to code? Oh, well, let me go on YouTube, which is the largest educational platform in the world, actually, is YouTube. Whether you want to learn guitar, whether you learn how to code, whether you learn how to play Minecraft better, whether you want to know how to play Fortnite better, it doesn't really matter. YouTube has it all. And so when they're spending time looking at the videos, they're not actually spending time just mindlessly going, oh, right? They're actually learning something to use as an application. They're doing it with purpose. My daughter is all into slime. I guess anyone who has a daughter probably knows about that. And she, especially my wife, it would drive her nuts when she's basically just building all these slime farms or whatever she's doing. But
She learned it from YouTube.
She learned it from YouTube,
Yeah.
and she learned about the chemistry. right? First it started with well, borax. Okay, what is borax?
Right.
What's in there? Why is this bad, right?
Contact
And
lens solution.
Yeah, contact lens solution. Why is that made? Why does it stick? Why, how can I make it better? Right?
Yes.
Actually, it was science class, right?
And then now what's the
Yeah.
name that you're going to give that color slime? Is it called
Exactly.
unicorn poop or not? You know, like, I mean, it becomes this whole creative
That's right.
enterprise.
That's right.
Yeah.
Your kids, with your question about, would you marry somebody
Yeah.
that you've been texting with 2 years, they were probably more appalled at the thought of marriage. They were probably like, no, I would,
Well-
do a few Tinder profiles first for a couple of years.
Well, actually, that's the interesting thing is that, because the next question I asked him, because I had read about it, is that IKEA is doing virtual marriages, where you can be with a person, but then all your guests are there virtually. So I don't know if this is a thing that is going to eventually happen, but it's something that I read about. So I asked him, and my son, who's a serious gamer, he was like, absolutely not. And I was like, why not? And it wasn't about the marriage. Because it's a momentous occasion, and you want people that you love to be there. And I was like, apparently we've attended enough traditional marriages that, comes up with this on his own. And he is not, a very sentimental person at all. So it gave me some hope.
So we've figured that we can't outsource the kids to the school, and we can't outsource the kids to the internet or to the computer. But in such a busy life, how do we actually, you're a professional, so
Yeah.
I'm saying it's a bit easier for you perhaps that's unfair, but for other parents, how would they then engage in this analog process, going from digital back to analog, to manage the kids themselves in the way you've been describing?
I think it's actually, I could be absolutely wrong in different people's perspectives, but I think it's actually harder for me as a professional because I'm #1 offender in terms of making sure I can respond to my emails. And that's my own loop of accomplishment. And so I have to work as a parent not to be on my phone because it's just, now I can't turn it off. And that's something that we struggle with. My husband enjoys photography and it's a wonderful hobby for him. But at the same time, he spends a lot of time editing photos and he's in front of a screen. So it's hard in that sense. I guess I'm saying that you can't really expect your kids to follow certain expectations if what's modeled at home is not. I mean, we have some sacred spaces. The table is one of them, dining table, restaurants, etc. All of that is one of them. But sometimes it'll be, sorry to say, my husband will be like, I'm just reading the paper. I'm like, it's still a screen. If you want, we can get a subscription to the paper and you can do that. But it's still a screen because you might as well be reading a work text. So.
I think schools, not all the schools are thinking as progressively as Harbour School, right? But I would say that the traditional role of a school of sort of passing on knowledge, I don't know that that's really the best model for the future. But I think it's important as a social environment, very much so. I think the skills that you develop in that. Now, the other thing when we talk about technology is, there's the engagement side, there's also the tool side of things. So when you look at technology and use it at home, actually, there's a lot you can do at home. And in fact, there's a world of knowledge that's available as long as you are willing to embrace that as well. So for instance, outside of learning from YouTube, I have some people, so we do video learning, right, with my kids, but not for tutoring or what happens in school. It's about that particular area of subjects that interest them.
Right.
So in the case of my son, it's guitar, right? Because the kind of way that he plays guitar, he can't find a teacher in Hong Kong to do it. Right? It's a percussive style.
So he's teaching himself.
So he first taught himself on YouTube, and then basically I got in touch with a person who actually has sort of created that style. And I said, hey, would you be willing to teach him? And then there you go, video conference. Right? That wasn't possible before. Right?
No.
And there's a difference when you start learning from a master versus learning from someone who might have sort of learned it in a way, but it's not the same. And actually that is available to everyone. Right? And not just for music, it's available for sciences. I haven't done this yet, but I'm thinking to myself, well, you can't learn about quantum mechanics in high school in Hong Kong. But I'm sure find him someone somewhere around the world who can teach him on a video conference. Right? That technology exists. It's not hard, right? It's real time. It's as engaging. Right? So this is where this is how we can help. And in the past, we took comfort in taking it from I'm talking to you, I talk to you, who do you know, right? it's the same thing. It's just now I have to go to the internet, right? Maybe I have to hang out in a circle of moms or something, right? I know, whichever, right? Go to the online platform, right? And get that information. Right? So I do think that actually I think there's more opportunity. I don't think there's less. But we need to come out of that sort of we have to unlearn what we thought was the right way of doing things, and completely sort of go with what we think is, because we're the curators.
Yeah.
We can control that as well. If you think it's not right, don't do it. Right.
Right.
You're the curators curating the knowledge of your children, watching what they're learning, and then helping them build on that platform.
I would say maybe the correct word is, I think we are, I personally take the view that as parents, we're mentors. So it's for me, for my 13-year-old right now, my conversation point with him, he's taller than me, so that also helps. Because I'm starting to think, wait a second, I'm more talking to him as a mentor than as a parent. And because he's bigger and stronger than me as well, I need to sort of watch out as well. But just thinking about that, it's like, what kind of relationship would I like to have with him in the long run? Right? And I don't know how it is, I don't know how it is for others, but I kind of wished I had a relationship with my mother which was more like a friend than as a mother. I don't know if that makes sense, right? Because there are things that I couldn't talk to my mother about, because that's not what you did, because she would tell me what to do, right?
You had the same childhood?
Yeah. Must be the Asian heritage.
Anyway, does anybody else here in the audience have some thoughts they'd like to share? Because we've talked about young children and the need to manage their time. Please.
Yeah, I'd just like to just add to what the speakers were saying. The way that I like to talk to my 9-year-old is we're very much like friends. So sometimes I'll download with him what I was doing today, who I had meetings with, where I'm going for business trips. Sometimes the kids will come with me for business trips, and then I get involved in their stuff as well. So if they go swimming with their friends, or if they're playing Lego, or if they're doing videotaping of a YouTube video of their Lego, then I'll participate as well, and I'll do the voiceover or whatever. So it's not a matter of them versus me anymore. It's more about us. So they also learn about the business world and the world they're around. Like they ask about, why are their shops closing down, or why is there poverty? And we talk about these questions.
Right.
The other thing which I think is great is Yat mentioned the mentorship around the world. So we do a video conferencing once a week with New York. And so Nathan, the 9-year-old, does an entrepreneurship project with a New York-based mentor. And so for me, usually when he talks to mom, it's like a one-word answer, like yes or no, and goodbye. So unless we're talking about other stuff. But with the mentor, I heard he was talking on the video conference for 75 minutes, over an hour.
Wow.
So that was more about project completion, focus, concentration, and some computer-related stuff. So I think there's a huge value in looking for mentors for our children, because they may or may not, they come to us for their hugs and kisses and for that love and the bonding. But in terms of other skills where we might not be able to help, we could look around the area for other skills. The other one that he really goes to is his Taekwondo teacher. So they spend a lot of time on discipline and a sort of a self-regulation and that sort of stuff. And I think if we actively look for those, it's also a good way to teach the kids. The other thing I'd like to say is maybe on the classical way of defining compliance. There was a lady here who said she wants the child to be obedient in class, and I would say that maybe we should sometimes challenge that, because I also read that children who are too compliant, they're also the ones that tend to get the sexual predators, because usually the answer they give is that they were just doing what they were told. So the fact that and I noticed that grandma was saying, the 5-year-old, you're a naughty boy, you didn't brush your teeth. But the child he was so angry, he just burst out and he says, I'm not naughty, and he just really fought back. And in the background I was saying, like, yay, because he was just reading a book, but grandma couldn't know. But sometimes being defiant or not accepting what you're being told, I think that could be a good thing.
Yeah, that Mac one, here's to the crazy ones, etc.
Sure.
Remember
Yeah.
that? I just wanted to say something about
about the future, right? Because a lot of us are here, we're here as parents, and we want our kids to be successful. And there's a lot that we don't know about what's going on in the next 20 years, but I remember this article maybe a few years ago that Google published about its study about what makes a good team. And I was reading it from a management perspective, you know, how can I help good teams and et cetera. And what surprised me was one of the details that they found is diversity makes a good team. So what I'm getting at with that is that if we as parents, both mentors and curators, because the reality is we are kind of curating their experiences in life, if we micromanage that and have them only have the right set of friends, or have them only be with kids of the right IQ, or kids who are have only one perspective, then we're really kind of doing them a disservice for that end of being able to communicate in lots of different ways with lots of different kinds of people. People who are either socially inept or extremely social or you know, domineering. You know, people need to be able to manage that. I know that that's something that I value as somebody who works in school with other professionals. And it just occurred to me that sometimes we as parents, you know, we want to protect our kids from difficult situations or difficult people, but sometimes that's how you learn. That's certainly how I learned.
Agreed. And I think also
Yeah.
when you talk about diversity, another skill that automatically develops is empathy.
Yes.
Because you have to deal with different cultures, you have to have an understanding that maybe was different. And diversity doesn't just mean ethnic, it means maybe, you know, income diversity, experience, all sorts of things, you know, learning differences. I mean, that whole range is something where you start developing and thinking around, oh, actually, this is how you're thinking about it, or this is maybe interesting. I never had that perspective, right? And having a different perspective is actually not something that is often promoted. And the more homogeneous an environment is, globally, typically the less innovative it is. Right? So if you look at, for instance, you know, what makes Silicon Valley sort of the innovation capital of the world, if you will. I mean, how many, so the example I give to people is, how many Californians do you know that are actually the CEOs and founders of these great tech companies in Silicon Valley?
How many Californians?
Californians.
Oh, it's a trick question. I don't know.
Not many.
Not many.
Yeah. So that's the point, right?
Because the beaches are too nice in California.
Yes, exactly. But they're also part of the sort of, you know, it's, you know, if you, whether they're from, you know, they're Indian, they're Chinese, Elon Musk is South African, you know, Larry Page and Sergey are Russian, you know, Zuckerberg is from the East Coast, all right? But anyway,
but it's going to be different countries.
Yes, but that's the point, right? Diversity makes them richer. It's not to say that Californians can't do it. I'm sure there's very many talented Californians. It's just that it's not because of the place. It's because of the diversity. And Hong Kong is like that too. If you think about who are the ones who built Hong Kong, they weren't born here.
Yes, right.
They're all over the world, right? Whether they came from the UK, from India, from China. And that's an environment though that sometimes because we want to protect, homogeneous protection if you will, we automatically shield them, and I think that's difficult.
It makes us feel safe, but it's kind of a false
I think so. But then, but online does find, again, I think the opportunity for being online is that you can create that sense, but still have some level of protection at start. And that's one way I think that YouTube is a great example of that.
Yeah.
So some positives for parents and time-pressed adults here, that if you need to be a mentor, and you don't go to school, you don't go around the internet, being a mentor need not take up all your time. It's more a question of selective guidance, helping children to follow their own interests and then build on those interests. And finding mentors, because everyone needs mentors. Parents are there for love and also for punishment, but if they're, well, obviously, that's why kids don't necessarily want to talk to their parents all the time. Mentors can help a lot.
And also allow yourself as a parent to be a little bit of a failure. One of my biggest parenting fails for myself is when, so I'm the kind of parent who's done envelope liners for birthday invitations, right? And one year I was just like, I was too busy traveling, a conference, etc. And I forgot to organize my daughter's birthday party. Now this is not a big deal, but it's a self-imposed pressure that I'm like, I'm not a good parent, let's bake a cake and do all this. And she noticed, and like a week and a half before the party, she's like, are you organizing my party? She was 12 at the time, and I said, really sorry, yes, I'm organizing your party. And then she looked at me and she said, I'll organize it. And I said, okay. I mean, you know, this was, I was feeling badly about it, but then she organized it, she did the giveaway bags, I gave her the money, and I had to be okay with what she picked. And this was an interesting lesson for me, because I think sometimes as a perfectionist parent, or sometimes as, you know, we sometimes wig out. Like I wig out if my husband buys the incorrect groceries or eggs. And that's not a good model for my kids, you know, because it's like I have to relinquish some of that control, and they're never going to be able to make decisions if I'm always making all of the quote-unquote best decisions and controlling everything. So I think it should be okay as parents. I don't think we hear this enough as parents, especially now. I think it should be okay as parents to be like, you know what, I need help, you take care of this.
So, just before we finish off, are there any more questions from the floor?
So what do you think are the plans or not plans? I mean, what would be good to don't kill the kids' diverse thinking? You know?
I'm sorry, what?
The kids' divergent thinking.
Yeah.
Like what would be the same like to help them to grow it? You know, like even the research though, you know, like 5 years old is 98%. And then we go down to 2. So what is for all of us as a people, you know, like if we are actually raising the new generation, you know, like how to help them don't kill it and just, you know, like kind of support it, you know, so they keep it and they are able to kind of live in the next future, you know, when we are not going to be there, for example, you know. What do you think is the good, or what, I don't want to say it's word right, you know, but how to do it, how to support them in this way?
Well, maybe, I guess our perspective, and I would say it not necessarily just as a parent, but kind of what we are looking for people who work with us in the company is, we want to have people who are very curious and are constantly curious. I think that's an important sort of mindset, and that coupled with a growth mindset. So basically just growing and being constantly curious. Now how you get there may be different for different people. But I find that when you think about the sort of very convergent style of most schools, curiosity is killed because you have only one right answer. The grading system is a form of killing curiosity, because actually the other way to look at curiosity is sort of if you're not curious, it means also you have less appetite for risk. Right? The more curious you are, the more interested you're taking chances. Right? The more chances you take, the more options exist. And generally more divergent thinkers are very optimistic in their mindset, because they see opportunity where others don't. And I think it's not a surprise that the ratio of entrepreneurs similar matches to the George Land study of 2% or single-digit percentages, because those people are always thinking of a situation that looks bad, but say, wait, that's an opportunity. So I would say try to foster, if you can, curiosity, and sort of, you know, the other thing, of course, is I find this is important. This is more personal anecdote, but I think. So one of, you know, I won't go into the backgrounds of the schools, but I switched schools, and the main reason why I let my children switch schools is because I needed my kids to have less homework. And the reason why I wanted to have them less homework is because I needed to have time for them to get bored. So what happened, the wake-up call for me was, I don't know, he was maybe 8 years old, 7 years, I forget how old he was. I was lying in bed, you know, probably a hard night, I don't know what it was. But I was basically sleeping in, right? It was like 9 a.m., right? For parents, that's sleeping in, I guess. And my son came in my room, you know, and he was like sitting on the bed, and he was saying, "Daddy, I'm bored. I don't know what to do. What do I do?" I was like, just go, just do something, you know, like play, right? He didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
Because he was told what to do, right?
Right.
And I was like, what do you mean you don't know what to do, right? And that was a wake-up call, right? And then I started questioning and thinking about all these things, because I never had this problem. But then again, my parents were working, and you know, they didn't care what I was doing in school. I was hanging out, playing, and nobody was looking, you know, in my spare time. And I had time to actually be bored, but then I actually had time to be. And boredom is a form of creative output, because you have to start imagining and so on. So anyway, that's some thoughts.
So Christine, thanks, Yat. Apart from encouraging curiosity, trying to manage an environment with less homework, what are the top 3 things you would do to encourage divergent?
Divergent
What
thinking.
should parents do?
What should parents do?
to
Oh,
finish
the
off.
pressure.
Just to finish off.
Okay, well, number 1 is learning is an emotional experience. A lot of us forget that. So if you're happy, you're going to learn better and more and be interested in learning more about a subject. And I say that because there's so many, I mean, life is a coercive experiment in so many ways, right? We don't do certain things, or we do certain things because we're afraid of a certain consequence. And I think it doesn't leave a lot of room for an openness and a genuine curiosity. One of the exercises that we have at the school, which is for 20 minutes, but believe it or not, took a really long time for it to get off the ground from the teacher's perspective, is we have a time 20 minutes in the morning where we have a subject or an art piece and they just talk about it. And to me it was a fun thing, it was a fun activity. But one of the things that a lot of teachers struggled with is there is no right or wrong answer. They kept thinking, I have to make them think something. And I was like, no, it's about you encouraging, it's basically this fertile ground of 20 minutes of conversation, and it's really just about open curiosity. One of my biggest pet peeves when I'm observing a classroom is when a teacher asks something but they really know the answer to it, right? Was that really a good choice? You know, and they know the answer is no. And I realize it has to happen a fair amount, but there are not enough opportunities where teachers or parents also are planting the seeds for people to generally be curious. You know, would you get married to somebody that you've only been chatting with for three years? I had no stake in that. I was just like, I don't know. I really don't know if the answer is yes or no. It's a genuine curiosity. And so there's that. The other section is error analysis. Sometimes when someone gives the wrong answer, I know this is something that we're experimenting with in math, is instead of just saying, no, the answer is wrong, just say, how'd you get to that? You know, oh, I see what you did there, and then just going through, can anybody think of this in a different way? Unfortunately, sometimes when you see the X mark, there's no real curiosity about that. And then the third is just cultivating a sense of playfulness, either as a parent or as an educator in classroom. Tinkering, I think, is a great idea. Talk about the stuff that doesn't work, allow them to fail, and allow them to take risks.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Yat, Christine.
Thank you.